Hey, welcome to Transform Your Workplace, where we explore the biggest ideas shaping the future of work. I'm your host, Brandon Laws, and today's guest is Matt Beane, the author of The Skill Code: How to Save Human Ability in the Age of Intelligent Machines. There are two books that come to mind when starting this conversation about AI and how it's going to shape the workforce. Matt's book is one of them, The Skill Code. The other one that I read is Ethan Mollick's book, Co-Intelligence. These are two must-read books if you're really diving into artificial intelligence. This conversation with Matt was incredible. Matt got into some critical issues facing workplaces today, which is mostly the widening gap between experts and novices in an AI-driven world. His insights on maintaining humanity's ability to learn and grow, even with advanced tools like AI, are eye-opening and very practical. And before we get into the conversation, I wanted to mention this episode is proudly sponsored by Zenium HR. Zenium has some really great learning and development programs. They're launched in 2025 that will help empower your workforce and stay ahead in today's competitive landscape. You won't want to miss this opportunity to invest in your people in a very scalable way. Before we get started, a quick ask for you. If you would connect with me on LinkedIn, if you're not already connected with me, I'll put a link in the show notes and the blog post as well. And if you would be so kind to share this episode with somebody who needs to hear this conversation, whether it's a colleague, HR leader, or some sort of tech enthusiast in your life, let's make our workplace better together. And let's start with this conversation here. Let's dive into the amazing conversation with Matt Beane, the author of The Skill Code. Hey, Matt, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, Brandon, really appreciate the invite. Delighted to be here.
We're going to talk about your book. It was out in June, I believe. It's called The Skill Code: How to Save Human Ability in an Age of Intelligent Machines. And it's actually funny. I was looking at the Amazon page for the book, and it below the description, it says, often bought together, Co-Intelligence and The Skill Code. I had just finished Co-Intelligence before I dove into your book, so it's kind of a perfect pairing. And I don't know if you've got a chance to read that as well, but in the age of AI, both of your books, like, people need to read those.
Yeah, well, and Ethan actually is one of the blurbers on the back of mine.
Amazing.
Ethan is a buddy. I've known him for a long time, and we started writing our books at around the same time, and his publisher hit the gas harder on him than mine did on me. It was unclear as to whose was going to come out first, and it's better for the world, I think, that his came out first, because it's kind of the generalist's overview, and I'm more of a surgical strike, no pun intended, given my research, into a particular implication domain, right? And of course, Ethan very generously cites me and my work in one of his, sort of makes it the centerpiece of one of his chapters.
Well, let's dive into the Skill Code. There's a lot of great stories and ideas in this book, and you even had a TED Talk too that sheds light on some of the stories in the book. So if people want a glimpse at that, I think it's like a 10-minute TED Talk. It's very well done. You described the relationship between experts and novices as or learners as elemental to humanity's transfer of skills. Elaborate on this point and how this method of learning is crucial, not only in the past, but in the future of the workplace.
Right. So I'll give you a very recent example and the most non-recent example that I was able to find in a year and a half of looking. I guess, why not for fun? I'll start with the oldest one known to man and womankind now is archaeology of apprenticeship that goes back 160,000 years to the advent of the first stored energy weapon in the history of our species, which is the bow. And the fun bit about that is that there's archaeological, a bow obviously is not a durable good. That is not going to survive. But what does survive are very clear patterns of waste product collection that are pretty well accord with the production of all the resources you need to put together to get a bow. And what's very evident there, and you can see it in the operating room using a robotic surgical device today, is that no one human being can do the job. That's a basic fact of our biology. So making a bow number one, even if one person could have all that expertise, which we can't. I mean, you've got multiple people. Somebody knows how to bend and make that bow. Somebody knows how to get arrowheads just so, the gut for the bow and so on. A couple people probably knew what you needed to know and were able to do it reliably. But they needed helpers to go fetch the resources from the environment. It's like a game of Minecraft. Like they went swarming out, grabbed the resources, brought them in, refined them. Then there's another group that would just like make small stones out of big ones. And then the final expert would take a small stone and make it deadly sharp and attach it onto an arrow. That basic fact of our biology and the kind of size groups we're in mandated this, like the most experienced person needs to be solving the most complicated problem. And then there are helpers who get resources and supply that person, but you can't not learn about what that expert's doing as you do it repeatedly, day in, day out. After a year, someone's looking up to you. And so there are piles of stone at each of those phases of transformation that you can see, from a riverbed up to a big pile of stones, to a small pile of stones, to arrowheads. And in the robotic OR today, you have a senior surgeon doing an operation and a resident, somebody who has a medical degree, many years of training and is trying to hyper specialize as a robotic surgeon now in the operating room, trying to help out in a way that builds their skills such that in 4 or 5 years, someone's looking over their shoulder. So tale as old as time, bedrock of our civilization and our expertise. Of course, in the book, I make the point that I found in my own research that we are, in a way that's very subtle and that nobody quite owns, subtly nuking that relationship for the sake of productivity, basically, from these new tools.
It's a lot of new tools. And there's a quote that I pulled out that actually talks about this problem that you describe in the book. So the quote says, "In millions of workplaces, we're blocking the ability to master new skills because we are separating junior workers from senior workers, novices from experts by inserting technology between them." End quote. So like organizations, a lot of them made a shift to remote work. We're also using new tools, automation, robotics, artificial intelligence. These tools are great, but it does create a barrier, doesn't it? So talk about this problem that many organizations are facing when it comes to that transfer of knowledge.
Yeah. So the first thing to say is I did find this first in robotic surgery. That was my dissertation back when I was at MIT. And I spent the next basically 3-4 years after those findings, the ink was sort of dry on those, to test, is this unique to surgery? It didn't seem like it would be. Published the TED Talk and a Harvard Business Review piece came out the same year, 2019, where I basically said, look, folks, I have looked in very diverse places where the technology is different, the occupation is different, the kind of organization is different, the nationality is different, and the same effect is showing up. And it does, in hindsight, make sense that this is the standard thing that's going on, because practically, if you invent a new automating tool, whether it is a bow or a potter's wheel or a robotic surgical device, or now ChatGPT, the way it adds value is that a single expert can pick that thing up and get more done, ideally with higher quality, than they could before. Experts love that. All of us, think of yourself, everybody listening to this is an expert in something. And when you can eat more of a problem and solve a more complicated problem, it's just intrinsically motivating to you. You feel fantastic. And there are probably people nearby who are grateful. Like there's this wonderful positive cycle that happens there. And you get better, by the way. So why would you not use that tool? Especially if the alternative is I need to rely on somebody who knows a little bit less, this person hauling stone up to me or helping to operate this robot, who is by definition slower and is going to make more mistakes. So if I get a new tool, I'm going to use it. Yes. And if that novice then is less necessary in the work because I can do more of it by myself, I'm more self-serve, when is the right time for me to electively, by active will alone, drag them back into the work for their benefit, but now no longer for my benefit? The answer to that in surgery was never.
Never, no.
15 minutes out of a 4-hour procedure instead of that resident being on task for 4 hours out of that procedure. So the expert loves that. By the way, the organization that buys that technology and hands it to the expert, they also love that. They see a productivity boost. It's not clear who has the opposite reaction to that problem, other than the novice. But even the novice is trying their best to get ahead. They don't know any different. They haven't been told that it used to be, right, or it's harder now than it ever was. They're just trying to do their best to become that next great surgeon or bow maker. And so I've landed on the conclusion that HR and L&D type functions and organizations have the professional expertise and the functional responsibility to tend to this novice optional problem in work. There's a thicket of challenges that come along with that, but I don't see any of the professional party that has the expertise to see that problem crisply and then has the authority to do something about it.
You paint such a beautiful picture that it's a scary picture, but it's a very illustrative picture of the problem that we're facing. So in one case, you have experts who now have a tool that they can do their job better, faster, and they feel good. Just like you said, like I use ChatGPT and other generative AI tools for my marketing profession. And because I know what I know, I'm able to do things at major scale.
Yep.
Versus if I was a new marketer, I don't know what I don't know. And I don't know how to use those tools. Probably no different than the story you tell in the book about Kristen, Beth, and the robotics doing surgery. You've got one of them who's probably an expert and the other who's had to go out of their way to learn how to use the robotics. Maybe unpack that a little bit more for me.
Sure. Yeah, no, and your story is very typical. After my study of robotic surgery lasted almost 3 years, and after about a year and a quarter of gathering data on robotic surgery, I came to my committee and I said, hey, look what I've discovered. It's really, really hard to learn how to do robotic surgery. And very proud about that. And most people are just failing because they're trying the old-fashioned way to learn, and that's blocked because now they're optional in the work. And my committee said, that's cute, kid, but that's not science. We knew that. We all knew technology makes things harder. I mean, nobody said those words, but that was the basic message. However, they also knew me and my data, and one of them said, so you found a few people who managed to learn anyway, really well, in spite of all this. Do they have anything in common? And I said, yeah, it seems like they're all relying on the same 3 practices in roughly the same order. And so then another member of my committee said, well, okay, look, if you can go out and systematically try to find these positive deviants, the people who are finding a new way to build skill that works, and it's the same, and they're not communicating with each other, they're not sharing practices, they're independently inventing that, then that's really strong evidence that there is a new way to build skill. We just don't know it yet, and you'll have discovered that. That's a paper, right? So I spent the next year only trying to find, basically through a blinded study where I couldn't tell who I was interviewing across 18 top teaching hospitals, what people were doing basically to try to learn. And I was given one resident who, according to the local best surgeon, was a very fast learner, and one who was a normal, in other words, failing robotic surgeon. And I didn't know who was who. I asked them all the same questions. And it turns out when I was unblinded, the people who were racing ahead were doing precisely the same things as those first 3 people that I found. This is 3 out of initially the top 5 teaching hospitals on the Eastern Seaboard. I found 3 individuals. And then I managed my way up to, tens, up to like close to 50. But the bottom line is they were all breaking norms and rules to get their skill. They were doing things that no one approved of. Everyone would cringe at, like operating on a patient when the senior surgeon is not in the room. And I saw this numerous times, and it's not against the law, as far as I know, but it's certainly not something anybody would say, oh yeah, that's the first best option for teaching somebody. Even the residents themselves knew, like, yeah, this is not how it's supposed to go. Up close, go ahead, read the paper. You'll read it. If that blew your hair back, you'll read the details. You'll be like, actually, okay, it's not obvious patients are worse off. Like, these residents might be rotating into places where the surgeon who was actually in charge was less competent than they were. And so, in fact, that patient's lucky that this rising star resident happened to rotate through their community hospital and could lead the procedure that day. Now, they were sweating, they were focused, they learned a lot. Anyway, the point is, these aren't things to be copied. Like, you don't want the world to go trying, the rule on the street can't be, let's all just do wildly inappropriate things to build skill. Procedures and rules and expectations are there for a reason. But what those people were willing to stick their necks out for, that's worth paying attention to. Like, why were they taking that risk? And that's the skill code. So that's the first third in the book. those three C's that are in that first third of the book, those are the conditions that those people were fighting, willing to risk their reputations and sometimes jobs to protect. So that's a pretty strong signal that those three things are elemental to learning because they took that kind of risk to get them.
For the benefit of the listener, let's go over those three C's real quick. It's challenge, complexity, and connection. Those are core to that first part of the book. How do those elements interact, and why do you think they're crucial for the development in not only past workplaces, but modern?
I'll answer the second part first. So why do I think they're crucial? So number one, just like I said, they showed up in my shadow learners data and across all shadow learners that I've found in numerous contexts now. So when you look at their practices on the surface, they're very different. Operate on a patient without a senior surgeon in the room is not the same as turn off your algorithmic recommendation system if you're an Uber driver, right? But in both cases, what those people are doing is preserving their ability to struggle near the edge of their capability. That's challenge, the first C. And complexity is engaging with the broader universe of skills, roles, and possibilities associated with your work rather than trying to get good at your focal task. Both are important, but complexity is look left, look right, understand who's doing what in the broader system and reflect on it properly. And then the third is connection, which is building warm bonds of trust and respect between human beings. We often don't think of that as like essential for skill development, but in the book I make the case, and certainly my shadow learners showed, that you get your opportunity to participate and learn because someone likes and respects and trusts you. And that comes from that human connection. But also you get your motivation to try hard because you want to earn trust and respect from people. That's part of what skill is for in the human psyche. So those three things, shadow learners taught me that. Then I spent a year and a half going through the literature across 13 scientific disciplines, mostly social science, but then I got into like neuroscience and so on. And it's just patently evident that they all have different names across different disciplines, but like in fields as far-ranging as archaeology, anthropology, education, psychology, social psychology, sociology, neurobiology, something about struggling to the point where you're not performing as well as you could, but you're not past or at your limits is really crucial for learning. Anybody in education or took even a single class about pedagogy would have heard terms like zone of proximal development or scaffolding and so on. I could go on and on. That's what I do in the book. But in short, the literature really, you just have to look at all those things and synthesize a new name that is the umbrella that covers off those three conceptual areas. Now, your first question is, how do they unfold, like interrelate with one another? That is undone science. So in chapter 7, I believe in the book called Reworking the Skill Code, I specifically direct a set of recommendations to everyone, which is, look, I'm giving you basically the alphabet for skill. Or in the case of DNA, there's a DNA image on the front of the book made of people and robots. We got the amino acids for DNA. That helped us understand the basic vocabulary of life, but not sentences, grammar, paragraphs, essay structure or something. And for skill development, we've long had theories about how we build skill that span long periods of time, go from novice through mastery and so on. But those they just break these days. There's too much different stuff going on. I thought it was more useful to give folks the alphabet, then you go figure out what grammar, sentence structure, essay forms makes sense in your context. And so I do think there is a really exciting time where we're all going to be learning about what sequences and mixes of challenge, complexity, and connection are particularly useful in what circumstances, for what reasons, with what technologies. We just don't really know.
Yeah. So I'm glad you started the book with this idea of shadow learners. I think it's really fascinating. And you, with the stories that you're telling and the research that you did, those are super high stakes, like surgeries and health environment. When you're bending and breaking the rules or going off the typical path of learning in that area, that could lead to catastrophic things, I would imagine. But I think you're really trying to hone in on other organizations could probably emphasize the importance of shadow learning. There's probably ways to do it with lower stakes. Have you thought about ways that organizations could sort of implement this into their culture without bending ethical barriers?
Right. Yeah. So step 0 is assume you have shadow learners in your organization. They're there. And what they're doing is they're picking up the latest technology, in this case, ChatGPT, say, And they're using it for work, whether or not you think that's appropriate, whether or not you've got policy to the contrary. The data in Microsoft's latest workforce report, 2024 report, makes it clear that, and I think it's very robust survey data, like 70% of the knowledge workforce is using this tech on their phones. And if you gave them a license, fine, they're using it. But in some cases, they'll still use their phones because they don't want you to know whether they're using it or what they're using it for. So assume that. And they're learning stuff and building skill that is extraordinarily valuable to your enterprise right now. And by the way, they're making mistakes that are extraordinarily harmful for your business. You've got to figure out all of that stuff. By the way, they need to learn from each other. All my shadow learners did it in isolation because they didn't feel that it was quite appropriate to be talking about what they were doing to build skill, because it wasn't. And so there's this massive learning waste that is normal, especially when the technology is discontinuous and you can hide using it. This is not a robotic surgical device. This is like on your phone. You might as well just be checking your email or texting a friend. So you have to create conditions where everyone is more liable to learn from each other rapidly about not what practices are you doing that are inappropriate, that are getting results in building your skill, but what's going on inside those practices that we could replicate in an appropriate, approved way, where a normal person who is not willing to bend and break rules could just implement it as part of their job. That's the phase transition. It's not, let's make this slightly less appropriate so we can all cringe less. It's like, okay, what's baby and what's bathwater, wheat chaff, pick your metaphor, and let's figure out the valuable beating heart of this practice and transform it into organizational policy. That's not an easy journey. Finding these folks and getting them to cough up their insights and their experiments is really hard. But how about starting with dollars, like compensation, like offering bounties for discoveries about new ways of learning how to deal with AI? Cash, that would help. What about some status like a badge, right? And include, by the way, cash and a badge for failures. Like, I found a really stupid way to use AI. And here's $1,000. Thank you very much. And have a badge for that. Now is the time for organizations to learn rapidly. And so folks need to feel like what they're doing in the shadows is critical business discovery, and everyone can benefit if we share successes and failures. So firms that already have a lot of good psychological safety instilled in them are going to do better here, because folks will feel an accountability to stand up and speak up about what they're learning. But there's no time like the present to change that kind of stuff.
That's well said. You talked about traditional apprenticeships in the book and how that's probably not feasible in today's environment. I've always thought apprenticeships were such a great way. And I wish there was some, besides the trades industries, if there was like a better way that we could bring people along faster. How do we do that in today's rapidly changing environment with technology, with more separation between people because of remote work and all the other barriers that are at play?
Yeah. So to me, you're preaching to the converted on this one in a sense. That is a $1 trillion problem for the economy. Not kidding. Best I can measure it, it is a $1 trillion problem. And what that means, if you take that seriously, that we are, for say 80% of working adults, skill development and reskilling and learning this new way of working is the fundamental challenge. And organizations are reliant on those people in their learning. Therefore, we are all in the same pot together. Then you need, I don't know, how about $1 billion of investment against that? That means multiple ways of answering that question. There are some firms out there that are already trying to build systems to, say, better match in real time someone with expertise with somebody who doesn't have it. So on a project basis, for instance, you might make better matches. And no human can do that in a complex with the flexibility and agility that AI could. So you might actually use AI as part of the solution to make better matches between human beings so you can initialize this process better, faster, in a more fine-grained way. Awesome. But that's using technology. So there are managerial solutions. There are solutions that workers themselves can implement. Like, look at your scenario, take this skill code and assess the health of these 3 C's. I give you a 10-point checklist for each in the book. Assess whether these 3 things are healthy, and if so, what can you do to nudge them in the right direction? So there's individual action too. I discovered after the book was done, actually, that there's another angle that I think is really essential that I'm pursuing technically now. And I wrote about this in the most recent post on my Substack, which is at wildworldofwork.org. And it's called Measure Twice, Spend Once. And basically, the idea there is we need a reasonably inexpensive way of measuring this problem in the first place. Like, how would you know if you were inadvertently de-skilling your workforce? We can't right now. It's down to your intuition and say so from a few junior workers who might be saying, I'm really struggling to learn now, or you don't notice it. And everybody's focused on productivity. So what is that? I recently realized and have co-founded a company with a guy named Juho Kim from KAIST in Korea, sort of Korea's equivalent of MIT, to build a new metric for firms so that you can see quickly what that trade space is like. Like, if you're implementing AI over here, to what extent is that going to inadvertently de-skill your workforce because it's breaking human connection, because it's collapsing the complexity away from people? They just get to their result faster and they don't maintain awareness of all the work they're embedded in, or it's just easier to do, faster, better, cheaper, easier. But that's not great because you lose challenge. So if you can see, okay, fine, we're deploying these licenses over here, but if we do it in slightly different way, we can have our productivity and boost people's skill instead. To do that at all, you need a new way to visualize work. You need a new way to make different, very fine-grained choices about which little tasks you want people to hold on to, which not to. But that is also just a tiny part of the problem. Like, it has to be an all hands on deck kind of thing.
Yeah. I'd mentioned to you before we started recording, there's a lot of HR people and leaders of people who listen to the podcast. And if you could speak to them about the threats that you see regarding human development that you're concerned about for the, let's say, the next 5 years, what are some of those things that might impact learning and development?
Well, so if you have listened up to this point, dear listener, and you're thinking, okay, all this reasonably makes sense to me, then what you are in for managing basically is you can't go back, as you said, to a traditional apprenticeship. But it does mean that you should assume that any process that has previously led to people, a work-related process that has led to people to have more capability, like you assume 2 years on the job and this person's good at X. It's not a safe assumption anymore without data, even if it's on their job description. So there are companies now that will extract the tasks out of the job descriptions that you progressed through, and then therefore model your skills for you. And that's not bad in and of itself, but you have to be assuming that the work design itself will in fact enrich your skills in the doing. So in critical business processes where skill is a premium, where talent is mobile, it's probably good to be sort of paranoid and aggressive about a solution. Paranoid about the problem and then aggressive about, okay, well, what evidence would I need to see? What data could I grab that would show me if novices are now optional in new ways in this work because of technology? Or if these 3 C's are compromised in new ways because we've implemented some new form of tech. Let's just pick generative AI. And once you get that data, then you can inform your decision making, because it could be that, in fact, it's not that big a deal and you're fine. Like, let's not assume your particular version of this is a problem. However, in general, the problem you will run into if you don't do anything about this, and it is going on, I can tell you is happening in surgery right now. So I did my studies in 2014 through to say 2013 through 2015 and so on. And so now new surgeons are hitting hospitals who have been through the process I saw. And of course, most of them did not end up with competence and confidence. And hospitals are having to invest additional money and time in remedial training for those surgeons that should be confident and competent with this new tool independently, but they are not. The quotes in my paper are not suitable for public television. There are senior surgeons who are very frustrated with the quality and capability of these independent surgeons. And so, in short, firms will start to have to spend more on the back end to do remedial training for people who should be experts.
So what I hear you saying is if organizations do absolutely nothing and they keep going on with the traditional learning and development methods, there's going to be a widening gap between experts and novices, and your novices will never catch up.
Some of them will, and they'll pay quite the price for doing so. Those will be your shadow learners, and they're important to learn from. They'll always be around. But in general, yes, especially when talent could just hop to another industry, a place where this novice optional problem is not so acute, when people have choices. The residents were very quick in surgery to figure out that what mattered is how much time you're letting me drive this robot, not whether you have a robot, not whether your surgeon's great. It's how much time do I get to drive the thing. And hospitals couldn't answer that. They didn't have the data. But residents heard it through stories and they avoided top flight institutions where they wouldn't have gotten a chance to play. So yes, the experts, by the way, are getting older. That's the other thing to say. Your firm's experts are, and that means increasingly out of touch with new methods, new tools. And so their expertise has a half-life, but that's a large population compared to this up and coming, precious, like demographically dwindling younger pool of workers. So this whole problem is not standing still on like 4 dimensions.
It's something that's coming up for me. Like about a year ago, I implemented a knowledge base system called Guru for our organization. And it was a way to like basically dump all the knowledge from like key employees and people who are no longer with us and processes and just get everything out there so it's accessible. And it's been a game changer in a lot of ways, but I still think what it's missing is like the hand-to-hand touch with the experts and the novices together, like to see it, to learn it, to hear directly from them versus just reading information on the web. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that is particularly difficult. YouTube, by the way, one of the other things my junior surgeons relied on extensively, those shadow learners, was YouTube. Like, how does anybody learn how to anything these days? They'll go to YouTube. It is perhaps the biggest positive development in the history of skill development since maybe movable type and the printing press. So that's what surgeons did. The ones who were successful spent maybe 100 times as much time on YouTube as a normal surgeon. And they were doing really different things as they got more advanced in video review than they were at the beginning. So there's a whole host of very effective and nested tactics that they'd use. And that was the poor man's substitute, so to speak, for getting to work with a senior surgeon. So what that told me is a couple of things. One, the making better, finer grained matches between experts and novices for the purposes of doing work. I give you, in the last chapter of the book, an image of what that might look like so that you can maintain that collaborative fabric, but across space and time. Is it ideal to be doing it co-located? Of course, but not always even. But even if you take that as granted, that's not a luxury that many of us can afford. And by the way, there are ways of doing face-to-face time that are terrible and wasteful. So assuming that though, like what if the best mentor for me was in Jakarta and I'm in upstate New York? Can I get some live help from that person? Sure, with a little bit of advance warning. They can talk me through something. And by the way, if I'm pretty good at, in the case of the book, welding, and this person's mentoring, then a couple kids in high school who are interested could also jump in for that session and watch. A retiree could too, because it's a good that anybody who's interested in building expertise around welding could tune into. So it's like a live stream for your work. Now, is that possible in all cases? Is it reasonable? No. I'm very confident that there are technologies that can and need to be built in that territory that will allow us to expand the pool of this matching in ways that make a mockery of what it used to be. You had to be within 6 meters of somebody. And so now you can be within just one planetary body. That's pretty cool. So that said, the reading stuff in Guru that you mentioned, or going online to, going to classes, reading books, those are incredibly powerful advances and give you that much more of a leg up such that when you get in the pool with that expert, you're that much better prepared to be paying attention to the fine detail so you can really jump to the edge of the problem rather than spending your first chunk of time kind of flailing and barely understanding what's going on. So we have to be doing all of these things, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You said at the end of the book that to rework the skill code to maintain and revive the 3 C's, we have to shift to the 3 D's, which are discover, develop, and deploy. In what ways are these going to help us adapt to the new world?
Right. I sort of got in alliteration mode in this book. So readers, if this annoys you,
I'm here for it.
It's a good mnemonic though. Bottom line, it's an echo of what I mentioned earlier around you asked this question about like, what's the right sequence for all this stuff? And my answer was, that's really unknown and it depends on your context. And so discover, develop, and deploy is basically assume you have shadow learners out there. Assume, by the way, you are unintentionally creating massive barriers to skill development in the way that you're handling technology right now. Welcome to the club. Go out and discover who is finding a way anyway and how you're hampering the skill code, and are there places where you're unintentionally or maybe semi-intentionally keeping it really healthy? Discover all of that, develop a new approach that's comprehensive, that scales those lessons for your organization, and deploy it and learn as you go, right? So, by another name, that is the same OODA loop that we've probably seen in consulting treatises back since McGregor in the 50s. Like, it's the same basic idea. Your local context has practices, values, tools, people, resources that are unique to you in key ways. You're the one who's best equipped to go figure out what's going on out there, pull it together into a coherent picture that everybody can benefit from, and then try to scale and learn as you go. I don't think beyond this book there's anybody who can really specify the details of how to approach things other than you, if you're the expert in your organization, working in collaboration with the folks that you rub elbows with. So that's the intention of that chapter, basically.
Well, Matt, this is good stuff. Your book is called The Skill Code, How to Save Human Ability in the Age of Intelligent Machines. Love the discussion. What do you want to leave people with as a parting thought or a call to action?
If you're compelled by this problem and you think that technology can be part of the solution, trot on over to mattbeane.com or theskillcodebook.com, same URL, same place, and join in the conversation. I've got a Substack there where I publish stuff that's not in the book that sort of expands in this direction, and more announcements to come there on the startup that I was just mentioning and so on. Other than that, this book is intended to be a field guide for you that is implementable the moment you start reading it. So if you find the ideas compelling, trust me, there are checklists in this book. There are how-tos, and there's firm guidelines that you can pick up and use to start to address and ask these questions and address them as you see fit in your local context. I'd say go for it.
My guest today has been Matt Beane, the author of The Skill Code. Matt, what a pleasure.
Likewise. Thanks a lot for the invite.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.